If the immediate and direct purpose of our life is not suffering, then our existence is the most bad adapted to its purpose in the world. Today it is bad, and day by day it will get worse until at last the worst of all arrives. We take no pleasure in existence except when we are striving after something. If there is no final end of striving, there is no measure and end of suffering. Life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and boredom. Man is the only animal who causes pain to others with no other object than wanting to do so. The two enemies of human happiness are pain and boredom. It would be better if there were nothing. Since there is more pain than pleasure on earth, every satisfaction is only transitory, creating new desires and new distresses, and the agony of the devoured animal is always far greater than the pleasure of the devourer. There is only one inborn error, and that is, that we exist in order to be happy. Suffering by nature or chance never seems so painful as suffering inflicted on us by the arbitrary will of another. Almost all of our sorrows spring out of our relations with other people. Satisfaction consists in freedom from pain, which is the positive element of life. It is a clear gain to sacrifice pleasure in order to avoid pain. The world is just a hell, and in it human beings are the tortured souls on the one hand, and the devils on the other. Nature shows that with the growth of intelligence comes increased capacity for pain, and it is only with the highest degree of intelligence that suffering reaches its supreme point. Artistic, moral and ascetic forms of awareness to overcome a frustration-filled and fundamentally painful human condition. Suffering is essential to life, and therefore does not flow in upon us from outside, but everyone carries around within himself its perennial source. Pleasure is never as pleasant as we expected it to be, and pain is always more painful. The pain in the world always outweighs the pleasure. If you don't believe it, compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is eating the other. Life is deeply steeped in suffering, and cannot escape from it. Our entrance into it takes place amid tears. At bottom its course is always tragic, and its end is even more so. The striving we see everywhere hindered in many ways, everywhere in conflict, and therefore always under the form of suffering. Thus, if there is no final end of striving, there is no measure and end of suffering. Undoubtedly it is the knowledge of death, and therewith the consideration of the suffering and misery of life, that give the strongest impulse to philosophical reflection and metaphysical explanations of the world. This world could not have been the work of an all-loving being, but that of a devil, who had brought creatures into existence in order to delight in the sight of their sufferings. The inexpressible depth of music, so easy to understand and yet so inexplicable, is due to the fact that it reproduces all the emotions of our innermost being, but entirely without reality and remote from its pain. Music expresses only the quintessence of life and its events, never these themselves. We all feel that we are something other than a being which someone once created out of nothing. From this arises the confidence that, while death may be able to end our life, it cannot end our existence. With man, sexual gratification is tied to a very obstinate selectivity which is sometimes intensified into a more or less passionate love. Thus, sexuality becomes for man a source of brief pleasure and protracted suffering. Everyone desires to achieve old age, that is to say, a condition in which one can say, "Today is bad, and day by day it will get worse, until at last the worst of all arrives." Our life is to be regarded as a loan received from death, with sleep as the daily interest on this loan. In the first place, no man is happy but strives his whole life long after a supposed happiness which he seldom attains, and even if he does it is only to be disappointed with it. Pleasure and well-being is negative and suffering positive. The happiness of a given life is not to be measured according to the joys and pleasures it contains, but according to the absence of the positive element, the absence of suffering. You can also look upon our life as an episode unprofitably disturbing the blessed calm of nothingness. What occupies all living things and keeps them in movement is striving for existence. With existence, however, when it is assured them, they have no idea what to do. Therefore, the second thing that sets them into movement is striving to be rid of the burden of existence, to render oneself insensible to it, to kill time, i.e., to escape boredom. If you try to imagine as nearly as you can what an amount of misery, pain, and suffering of every kind the sun shines upon in its course, you will admit that it would be much better if on the earth as little as on the moon the sun were able to call forth the phenomena of life, and if, here as there, the surface were still in a crystalline state. One can even say that we require at all times a certain quantity of care or sorrow or want, as a ship requires ballast, in order to keep on a straight course. The greatest wisdom consists in enjoying the present and making this enjoyment the goal of life, because the present is all that is real and everything else merely imaginary. But you could just as well call this mode of life the greatest folly, for that which in a moment ceases to exist, which vanishes as completely as a dream, cannot be worth any serious effort. The life of an individual is a constant struggle, and not merely a metaphorical one against want or boredom, but also an actual struggle against other people. He discovers adversaries everywhere, live in continual conflict, and dies with sword in hand. The best consolation in misfortune or affliction of any kind will be the thought of other people who are in a still worse plight than yourself, and this is a form of consolation open to everyone. But what an awful fate this means for mankind as a whole. We are like lambs in a field, disporting themselves under the eye of the butcher, who chooses out first one and then another for his prey. As a reliable compass for orientating yourself in life, nothing is more useful than to accustom yourself to regarding this world as a place of atonement, a sort of penal colony. When you have done this, you will order your expectations of life according to the nature of things and no longer regard the calamities, sufferings, torments and miseries of life as something irregular and not to be expected, but will find them entirely in order, while knowing that each of us is here being punished for his existence and each in his own particular way. This outlook will enable us to view the so-called imperfections of the majority of men, i.e., their moral and intellectual shortcomings and the facial appearance resulting therefrom, without surprise and certainly without indignation. For we shall always bear in mind where we are and consequently regard every man first and foremost as a being who exists only as a consequence of his culpability and whose life is an expiation of the crime of being born.